Hi, and welcome to the New Rules for Negotiating 10-Minute Learning Series, a short but comprehensive series of contract negotiation webinars specifically designed for people who negotiate complex customer-supplier agreements. This webinar is based on information you can find in my book, Getting to We. Today we're going to talk about how you can evaluate the compatibility and trust of your customer-supplier relationships. We're going to be talking about using an assessment tool called the CAT, and how this tool has helped customers visualize their ability to be compatible and trusting with suppliers and vice versa, suppliers with customers. This is helpful for you to determine whether you want to invest in your relationship and take it to the next strategic level. All right, so partners who trust one another when neither side has a reason to expect that it will be taken advantage of, and whenever possible, it will even do things that advance the other's interest. This is an incredibly important part of the idea of what's in it for we and creating a collaborative environment between strategic partners. Compatibility and trust are enablers. Compatibility enables a joint commitment to a shared goal, while trust enables commitments to be performed to each other. These concepts tie directly to performance. Your performance is the buying company to your end customer, and then your dependence on the performance of the supplier. So this interdependent relationship requires a fair amount of trust, and trust is built upon compatibility. All right, so I'm Jeanette Neiden, author and co-author of 3 books, including Getting to We, Vested Outsourcing Manual, and Negotiation Rules. I work with contract professionals by providing tactical, customized contract negotiation training and coaching from the planning phase through to execution. I work with both sales and purchasing professionals, usually at the same company and sometimes even at the same time. All right, I throw this image in a little tongue-in-cheek. I have a client who harbors resentments against one of its service providers. My client had felt that his organization and himself as a negotiator had been taken advantage of by a supplier 15 years ago, and it impacted a recent negotiation in that it was very hard for him to trust any of the information coming from the service provider. However, now it's 15 years later, he's at a new organization with a different team from the service provider, and actually the compatibility between the buying company and the supplier was very high, performance was exceptionally high, and trust at the day-to-day level was very high. So the compatibility and trust assessment that I'm about to talk about can help your organization determine if there really is good compatibility and trust between your company and the service provider, and not allow one individual to cast a shadow over the entire relationship, either positively, ignoring the service provider's performance issues, or negatively, blowing them up out of proportion. So let's talk about the researchers who completed the compatibility and trust assessment. The Compatibility and Trust Assessment, or CAT, was developed by Dr. Jerry Ledlow and Dr. Carl Manro to measure the strength of business relationships. It's based on research. So it supports Dr. Oliver Williamson's research. He's a Nobel laureate economist, where he and 2 others received the Nobel Award for their work in transaction cost economics. It builds on Dr. Stanley Fawcett's research on buyer-supplier trust, and it was vetted by myself when we originally developed the Compatibility and Trust Assessment. It seeks to show buyers and suppliers where they have gaps in order to help them foster a stronger relationship. There are 5 dimensions to the Compatibility and Trust Assessment. First, trust. So we establish the performance to promise and meeting commitments. Now, this is the foundation, because without some level of performance, both towards the buyer and towards the supplier, there cannot be trust, and we really cannot move forward in the relationship. Innovation. Strong and trusting relationships allow the parties to share risks and rewards, investing in each other's capabilities, collaborating to achieve common goals. Communication, the open and timely sharing of all information that is relevant to a partner's decision-making ability. This is key, the sharing of information that is relevant to your partner's decision-making ability. Team orientation, both sides of the relationship believe in the relationship and act in that capacity of believing in the relationship. Efforts are made to view decisions from the partner's perspective, to mitigate opportunism, and to promote collaboration. And then finally, there is a common purpose and direction, or what we call focus. When the 5 dimensions of compatibility and trust are cultivated, relationships can prosper due to greater collaboration and better performance, which ultimately is what everybody wants. All right, so there's a structure to the assessment. It's a 360-degree worldview, or what we would also call a 2 worldview, because the buying company provides responses about their own organization and their perspective of the service provider. The service provider provides responses about their own organization and their perspective of the buying company. The survey tool asks participants to rank statements on a scale from not at all to always. In addition, the survey collects some demographic data which better understands the roles of the individuals who are completing the assessment. And the survey is anonymous. And this is important because this allows people to be honest without retribution. So let's start looking at visualizing the scores. In this particular sample, this is an average score. Looking at the average score indicates the areas where the parties need to improve together in order to have what we would call a we relationship. And if you want to know a little bit more about that, please get my book, Getting to We. This particular sample shows that they have a way to go in many of the areas, that they're at a little over 80% in terms of trust, which is good, but you can see they're lagging in focus, team orientation, and then especially in communication and innovation. Now this is a different sample, and this shows a tremendous gap between the buyer's perspective of the service provider and the service provider's own perspective of itself. You can see that the service provider and the buyer are far apart in all the areas, with the service provider having a greater perception of its own skills and abilities. Now, it's not unusual that there's a gap, but a gap this much is unusual. Visualizing this score, you can see the buyer's score. So this is the buyer's perspective of itself and the service provider's perception of the buyer. You can see here that when it comes to communication, they're completely aligned at just under 80%. But in other areas, you can see that the buyer rates itself more team-oriented, focused, trusting, innovative than the supplier rates itself. Again, this is normal, and this is probably a more accurate type of result that I would typically see, where there's some alignment and some gaps, but not necessarily as large as we saw in the last slide. Now, in this particular slide, we're visualizing the scores by the dimension. What this means is that and this, by the way, we're not using the same data as before, but in this sample, you can clearly see that the buyer's score of itself on the issue of focus is only 57%, and the supplier's perception of the buyer on focus is also low, only 65%. Now, this is a problem because the buyer is unfocused while the supplier is focused on doing what the buyer wants when the buyer can be focused, right? So the buyer's perception of supplier and the supplier's perception of itself is fairly high, 81 and 95% respectively. But with the buyer not being focused, here's an additional problem. They also then criticize the supplier for not being innovative. The problem is that the supplier can never be perceived as being innovative, bringing new ideas to improve their own performance if the buyer is unfocused, because anything that they bring is a mismatch to what the buyer is focused on at the time. So this kind of a red-green yellow scorecard can be enormously impactful in identifying where the problems are in the relationship at a foundational level. And again, you can see there are yellow scores for the buyer in team orientation and communication. So there was a general sense on the buyer's organization that they were not internally aligned, and the supplier was playing catch up, doing fairly well. But with some focus and communication and team orientation, the relationship could really take off. Now here's another visualization. This is all the scores. Again, this is a different sample which demonstrates the supplier's perceptions of itself and the buyer's perceptions of itself and the supplier based on different shades of gray and orange. What this particular scorecard demonstrates is the areas in which the organizations still have a lot of room to grow. It's a different visualization. Some teams like the red, green, yellow scorecard. Some teams prefer this. But basically, the compatibility and trust assessment gives you a 360-degree assessment of the relationship. It's fast, it's easy. You can have your team members take it. You get the information you need. And our customers have used this in order to determine whether to enhance the strategic relationship that it has with a supplier. And suppliers have used this to determine whether they want to invest in their customer. If you'd like to learn more, please let me know and get the book, Getting to We, where we have an entire chapter on the compatibility and trust assessment where we explain it in even greater detail.